Good evening. Doron, can you open my screen? Yes. Okay. Good evening, Barbara. Good evening, everybody. I am sure from the amount of people who have put their names down to be part of this evening, you all know who Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett is. But I think it's only fair to say a few words about Barbara before we begin our discussion. The most recent, maybe I'm wrong, but the most recent prize that Barbara was granted was the very distinguished Dan David Prize from Tel Aviv University. She's, of course, well known for her very important work, Destination Culture, published quite a few years ago. And then, of course, the wonderful book that she did with her father, They Called Me Meyer, Painted Memories of Jewish Childhood. And of course, Barbara has been involved in so many different museums. But of course, the center of the discussion this evening, not the only issue, will be her tremendous work in Warsaw, being the core figure in creating the museum in Warsaw today called POLIN. Barbara was involved in the museum for many years in its creation, and she continues to be an important advisor to the director of the museum. So good evening or good afternoon to those of you abroad. Good afternoon to you, Barbara, whether you are in New York or in New Zealand or somewhere else. I'm going to begin with a very simple question. How would you have defined the goal of POLIN in 2006 when you began, and how would you see the goal of POLIN today?
Well, actually, I began with this project in 2002, and the project itself was conceived in 1993. So we have a few key moments to try to understand this project. The idea for it arose in 1993, 4 years after the fall of communism, which is hardly imaginable because this is a really new democracy. It's immediate post-communist Poland. And at that moment, the idea was that the history of Polish Jews had been completely overshadowed, understandably, by the Holocaust, and in many ways reduced to the Holocaust and only viewed through the lens of the Holocaust. And this idea for the museum came into focus with the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And I don't know, was there a glitch in the reception? I hope not. I hope that the screen didn't freeze. In any event, representatives of a Jewish NGO in Poland, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, it was established in Poland in 1951. They sent representatives to the opening of the Holocaust Museum. And Grażyna Pawlak, one of them, had the idea that if there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And that's really the beginning of it. It really was an attempt to recover a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews in the place where they lived and in the place where they died. And so that was the starting point. And 4 years after the fall of communism, I began consulting on the project in 2002. And by that time, I would say that it was still pretty much the same mission. And also in 2006, when we had actually formally founded the museum, we had completed the international architectural competition for the building, and we were ready to proceed with the exhibition. And my role, and it was under the direction of Jerzy Halberstadt, who really was vital to this project for a very long time. But my role was to lead the development of the permanent exhibition. And I would say that this was still pretty much the mission. And I think what's critically important is that in the period of the most intense work on the project, it was conducted under the center-right government. so that the government of Poland at the time was Civic Platform. The ruling party was Civic Platform, which was a center-right political party. But I should say that from the very beginning, every president of Poland and every mayor of Warsaw, no matter what the political party, supported the project. So there was a kind of bipartisan support of the project from the beginning all the way through. But during the critical period, we were creating we were building the building, making the exhibition under the center-right party, Civic Platform. So what is the big change and where do we find ourselves now, which goes to the heart of your question? And that is that in the last 6 years or so, the government, the ruling party is PiS, which is the Law and Justice Party, which is a right-wing party. And it's a right-wing party that has within its fold, not only, I would just say right-wing, but also extreme right-wing. And the political ground has shifted very, very strongly. And if I can just maybe highlight two ways in which this shift is expressed. So first of all, this ruling party has developed its own, what you might call, well, what they call historical policy, which from Polish can be translated as historical policy or also as politics of history, because all historical policies are engaged in what you would call a politics of history. And their politics of history is stated very clearly: to defend the good name of Poland. And when the president of Poland was campaigning for his presidency, his platform was down with the pedagogy of shame, up from our knees. And the Institute of National Remembrance, which is the main archive and the main institution responsible for the history of modern Poland, their mission has been defined as that what they're supposed to do and everything that they do is to, quote, defend the good name of Poland. Well, we know that such a mission is not a way to write good history. It's not a way to make a great history museum. So that would be the first thing. The second has to do specifically with POLIN Museum. Where is POLIN Museum in this politics of history, in this historical policy? So on the one hand, we are good news. We're the best ambassador to the world for Polish-Jewish relations. And even the ruling party knows that. So when President of Poland goes to Israel, and in Israel he's asked, what about anti-Semitism in Poland today? His answer is, what do you mean? Look at our beautiful Jewish museum. But on the other hand, there is enormous pressure on the Minister of Culture and on the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Education and on the Foreign Ministry, tremendous pressure from not only the right wing, but from the extreme right wing to somehow or other take control over this museum, over POLIN Museum, which they cannot do. They cannot take full control because it's the basis for it is a public-private partnership. And as a result, the Minister of Culture cannot exert unilateral control over it in the way that he could over the Museum of the Second World War, for example. So as a result, there is an uneasiness with our relative autonomy and independence. And what does that mean? It means that when we tackle difficult issues, which we do in a way that is sensitive and responsible, like, for example, the anti-Semitic campaign of March 68, because we commemorated it in 2018, the 50th anniversary, and we commemorated it with a whole year dedicated to that event and its contemporary resonances today. And that provoked a huge, huge backlash from the Minister of Culture and from his right-wing supporters. And then we saw something which, in my experience, was new. And what was new was that until about 2 or 3 years ago, I never heard anyone describe POLIN Museum as anti-Polish. And that's new. And what does it mean? It means that anytime that you say anything that does not defend the good name of Poland, you are de facto behaving or speaking in a way that is anti-Polish. So that means, and anti-Semitism is an extremely sensitive topic. One of the most hurtful thing you can say to someone in Poland is you're anti-Semitic. It is an extremely sensitive topic. So those would be the two, I would say the two things is the cultural policy, defend the good name of Poland, and when we as a museum do what we should do as an institution of public history is tackle difficult issues, strengthen the resilience of civil society, model informed and civil debate, create an open space for difficult discussions. When we do that, and when we do it around a topic for which we are the best prepared, for example, the anti-Semitic campaign of March 68, contemporary anti-Semitism, whatever it might be, that is from a right-wing perspective and an extreme right-wing perspective, that is seen as, quote, anti-Polish, and it is condemned as being, quote, too political. And one last thing, if I may, is it is an expression of the kind of museum that the Minister of Culture doesn't want. And what emerged very, very clearly in the debates around POLIN Museum and around the March 1968 exhibition is two completely different conceptions of a museum. The, quote, traditional museum, and I am quoting, that presents a, quote, objective history, which means, of course, the consensual, canonized, authorized history that the government wants to promote, and a, quote, modern museum, and I am quoting, like POLIN Museum, where, and I quote, history is a starting point for debate. In other words, there is no room for dissent. That is, no room for dissent. And so we are a modern museum. We are not the right kind of a museum. And we are contrasted with what I would consider to be a 20th century or maybe even a 19th century museum, whereas POLIN Museum is a 21st century museum, and it is not an instrument of state historical policy and is therefore a thorn in the state's side.
Barbara, it's wonderful to have this conversation because right away you get into all the serious issues and you're right on top of all the political problems that you faced. I want to go back a bit, if I may.
Absolutely.
And ask you two questions. One is, you spoke about the Polish side. What kind of politics, pressures, attention from the Jewish side?
Well,
people in different countries and so on and so forth. And at the same time, because I'm sure that you'll be able to relate to this, how did you deal with the periods of difficulty in the Polish-Jewish context? For instance, Chmielnicki, the 1648-1649. How did you deal with anti-Semitism in Poland, knowing that you had these Poles with a particular perspective? And you also, of course, knew you had to deal with the ways in which Jews would be looking and expecting this museum to represent suffering for Jews. So,
okay.
Since you started with the Polish issue, let's talk also about the Jews who are obviously trying to make a decision on how this museum should turn out. Yes, go ahead.
So let me start again with the beginning and go from the beginning to the end. All right. So when I first began presenting the project to American Jews specifically, they absolutely were skeptical. They said, why, of all the places that you could create this museum, why are you creating it in Poland? So I said, well, where should we make it? They said, you should make it in New York. You should make it in Tel Aviv. I said, why? They said, because that's where the Jews are. So, of course, we were not, and frankly, had we tried to make such a museum in Tel Aviv or in New York, it would never have the impact. It would never be the museum that it is. That's clear. So I said, we feel it's important to make the museum in the place where the story happened and to make it facing the monument to the ghetto heroes on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, on the site of the pre-war Jewish neighborhood of Warsaw, home to the largest Jewish community. At one point, it was the home to the largest Jewish community in the world. That's where we should make it. So then their next skepticism was, oh, they said, this museum is going to whitewash this history, and it's going to whitewash anti-Semitism, and the government is making it or wants it because they want tourist dollars, they want it for money, they want it for PR. So I had to answer all those questions because, first of all, at that stage, and forever, it was never a government project. It was initiated by a Jewish NGO in Poland, by the association, which was established in 1951. And from 1993 until 2005, the association was solely responsible for it. And when the museum was founded in 2005, it was founded as a public-private partnership of the association, the Ministry of Culture, and the city of Warsaw. So that was the first profound skepticism. And it was like, I'll never set foot in Poland. I don't want to spend a penny in Poland. And it was very, 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 very negative. And that ground really shifted. And what I would say is that the museum, I would say, it came to have value for a Jewish public. And I'll talk about the difference between American Jews, Israeli Jews, and Jews in Poland, because there are quite a few differences. So I think for American Jews, it was a revelation. For many of them, well, first of all, most Jews come to Poland to commemorate the Holocaust. And one of our greatest concerns was that we find a way for them to visit this museum without them visiting it in a way that it becomes a Holocaust museum for them. In other words, where all they're interested in is the Holocaust gallery, and all they can see is how this history begins with hate and ends with genocide. So we had a huge task to engage them in this 1,000-year history in a way that was not defined by the Holocaust. That was a huge, huge, huge challenge. And I think that in large measure, for the most part, we succeeded. And what it meant was we got responses from them like, I had no idea, 1,000 years. How did they come to Poland? How did Poland become home to the largest Jewish community in the world? 18th century, half the Jewish population of the world was living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, 750,000 Jews. How did that happen? Continuous Jewish presence. They were never expelled. What's going on here? I had no idea. So, and what's more, one of the most moving moments was I had a visitor who came obviously for the Holocaust. And where did she weep? Literally weep? Not in the Holocaust gallery, but in the early modern gallery, in the gallery dedicated to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to the so-called Golden Age, because it was so incredibly beautiful that she was just overwhelmed. So overall, we've gotten really great responses. Now, overall, generally, now there, of course, are those who feel Holocaust should be more prominent, those who feel that anti-Semitism should be given more weight. There are various and sundry, or that, whatever it might be. But that basically, I would say, is the American Jewish response. From an Israeli response, I think that it's usually part of an itinerary for the youth groups, also for adult groups. Some of them don't allow very much time. They usually come with their own guides. They have their headphones. So it's really hard to judge. It's very hard for me to judge the nature of their experience. But there's no question that it sits very strongly within a Holocaust Zionist narrative, that it's very much part of the itinerary that locates Poland and the Holocaust in relationship to the forming of the State of Israel. And I would really probably put it to our listeners to tell us more about the Israeli response to the museum and a visit. But from the Polish Jewish response, it's fascinating for me. So there's, and these are individuals who are born, raised in Poland, live in Poland today, are Jewish. Some of them knew from their childhood or grew up in Jewish families. Others grew up in a Catholic family, only learned much later that they were the children or grandchildren of Jews, whatever it might be. So there are two key responses, and they also go to your question about how we deal with anti-Semitism and Khmelnytsky and the difficult topics. So, but one of them really struck me as fascinating, from a very intelligent and very sympathetic and very important literary critic. And he said, there's not enough Judaism. Now, I thought to myself, how is that possible? So first of all, we never talk about Judaism. We talk about Jewish religious life, but not about Judaism as a religion, as a denomination. he said, get rid of that forest that is the opening experience, he said. And he said, you should have a 10-minute presentation of Judaism. He said, give your visitors and I quote, a Judaism pill before they enter the exhibition so they'll know. And because I think that for many people in Poland today who identify as Jewish, the way they secure a very insecure Jewish identity is by rooting it in the most incontrovertible marker of being Jewish, which is Judaism, and in the most unassailable form of Judaism, which is Orthodoxy. And I think of it as a very specifically post-war, post-communist phenomenon in Poland. So for him, there wasn't quite enough Judaism. So my answer was, the reason that you feel there isn't enough is because there's no pill. It's not all there in one place. It is all the way through the exhibition from beginning to end, because Jewish religious life is an integral and integrated part of the story, not a separate, from our point of view, not a separate topic. And there are many, many ways in which it's expressed, and they are historically specific and contingent. And we wanted to avoid, above all, normative Judaism. Any kind of...
But Barbara,
yeah.
The nuances which are so well presented in the museum, do people respond to the nuances? There are moments of difficulty, and there are other moments. There is a great period, so to speak. There's a golden age, and then there's a troubled period, and then there's maybe another golden age. Are people aware of the nuances in the exhibition? And I was also wondering to what extent this has become something which Poles and Jews, when they come to the museum, they're aware of this notion of 1,000 years of Jewish history.
Okay, so let me respond to that by first answering the question about difficult topics and anti-Semitism, because I think it's critical. So on the one hand, this literary critic wanted more what he called Judaism. But on the other hand, he and I would say a whole generation of scholars who have been doing the most important work on the Holocaust and on the Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust in the wake of Jan Gross's book, so from 2000 onwards, and especially at the Center for Holocaust Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences. They have really been leading the charge in confronting the most, I would say, most painful, most difficult aspects of Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust. For them, the fatal flaw, there are two fatal flaws in the exhibition. One is they say there is not enough emphasis on anti-Semitism, that it's not dealt with sufficiently and I would say in a more confrontational way. And the second is they wanted a stronger curatorial voice. They wanted we as scholars and curators to state clearly and strongly to our visitors what we think about these topics. And our curatorial approach was a very, very different one. And our approach to anti-Semitism is the same as our approach to Judaism, which was that that is to say, first of all, that even the word itself is for us a development of the late 19th century and linked to the emergence of racial anti-Semitism, that before that we speak of anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish, we speak of tumults, massacres, riots, but we don't speak of pogroms, we don't speak of etc. So I would say that was for them an issue. And in that case, I wouldn't call that a Jewish response. Some of them are Jewish, some of them aren't, but it would be a response from our Polish colleagues specifically. But overall, as to whether visitors get it, I do believe they do. And one of the reasons is that this is an exhibition, not a book. And as an exhibition, we have a commitment, we have a responsibility to communicate our main messages clearly so that they are what we call layer one, and that if a visitor were to only skim, I mean, they say of our visitors, they come in three varieties. They come as skimmers, swimmers, and divers. The skimmers should be able to skim and get the main message. The swimmers should be able to come down one layer and get more information. And the divers should be able to explore a topic in depth. so that there is what we call a hierarchy of communication. And the hierarchy of communication is to get that big message across. The big message is not about nuance, but it's also not about a master narrative, and it's not prescriptive. The entire approach is to be authoritative without being authoritarian. And that means to construct what we call an open narrative with open questions. And the intention is that visitors should go away, if you will, curious, provoked, interested, and better equipped to have intelligent conversations.
Barbara, I'm wondering about a moment in the exhibition which you would say brings the most focus for individuals coming to the museum, and why would that particular place be the one that engages them more than anything else?
Well, I have
Would that be the synagogue?
Yes, I have two answers. One has to do with a point of personal connection. Finding your father in a photograph in the exhibition. In other words, somebody came to us and said, I found my grandfather in the exhibition. He had died 20 years ago. We said, how is it possible? They said, I saw him in a photograph. So the point of personal connection is something that is profoundly, profoundly meaningful to visitors. But the second is, I would say by far, it would be the reconstruction of the wooden synagogue that once stood in Gvozdets, which is today in Ukraine, by far.
And why do you feel that that attracts people? Because there's something that I think we should relate to in this conversation, and that is that the museum has very few original objects. Was this part of the conception, or was this part of the tension within the various museums in Warsaw today?
Okay, so I would say that it was a virtue made. It was a virtue made of necessity, and so let me start with this. We created this museum literally on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto and the rubble of the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. It means that literally on an ocean of rubble. And we have wonderful photographs that show the unveiling of the ghetto, the monument to the ghetto heroes on a pile of rubble. So that for us is very important, literally and metaphorically, for our starting point, that our single greatest object is in fact the story. And I think of this as a museum of intangible heritage. Of course there's tangible heritage, and we do work with it, but our greatest asset is what I would call intangible heritage, which I think museums have only in the last 30 years or so, or 20 years, started to acknowledge as a critical piece or critical part of who they are and what they do. So the first thing is the rubble. And that means we started without any historical fabric of urban fabric, buildings, etc. This is not Amsterdam's historical district with its synagogues. We started without a collection, and we started without a pre-existing building of any kind. So on the one hand, it's a blessing because we could start from scratch and we could do anything. And on the other hand, it was a curse because we would have loved to have a great collection. However, even if we had a collection, and we did draw from the collection at the Jewish Historical Institute, and we did loan and we did borrow objects from the National Museum in Krakow, which has a Judaica, very interesting, incidentally, Judaica collection, and from YIVU Institute for Jewish Research, and from other places. The fact of the matter is what's left from the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews by way of objects is almost exclusively 19th and 20th century. There are only two kinds of objects from the Middle Ages: tombstones and coins. A coin the size of a shekel, smaller than a shekel. And from what? So we're talking about 10th century, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th. When you get to the 18th century, then you might have some Torah curtains, you might have some Judaica. If you've got anything, it's going to be Judaica. And from the 19th century, it's going to be paintings, photographs, medals. It's not going to be ethnographic material. I mean, yes, Ansky collected some ethnographic material before World War I, but you do not have any collection in the world today that has the original objects that could support a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. So that's point number one. Point number two is that on the one hand, we were not burdened with a collection and forced to base the narrative on an existing collection with all of its limitations, because our first priority and our greatest object was the story. And so what we did was to create what I call a theater of history, and we have hundreds of objects in the exhibition. But you know, for all of the pressure on the part mainly of our Polish visitors, because they expect great objects, we have some wonderful objects, but they don't pay any attention to them. I mean, maybe, you know, because who knows why, it's another whole conversation. But we have some very beautiful original paintings. We have some really wonderful original objects from the Cohen, a medieval coin with Hebrew inscription, all the way through to paintings by Jonas Stern and others. So, and we're about to acquire an enormous Minkowski painting. So we have objects, but the objects are there to support the story rather than starting from the objects and trying to tell the story through them. And that is the strategy. And so that basically is the strategy from the very beginning.
Barbara, I'm interested also when you were working on conceiving the museum. There are all these Jewish museums in different places in Europe. And this is, of course, not called a Jewish museum, intentionally not called a Jewish museum. Right. How would you compare, for instance, what POLIN has done to what, let's say, the Berlin Jewish Museum has done in terms of its conception of history, one to the other?
Well, okay, so I would say that actually you're probably more similar than different, honestly, but I'm happy you raised this because I always say that POLIN Museum is not a Jewish museum. And I mean that, and usually I get a lot of pushback. What do you mean it's not a Jewish museum? Well, we can argue as long as you like about what is a Jewish museum. And I consider that to be an open question. Is it by Jews, about Jews, for Jews? Well, the old ones were in large measure, not entirely, but in large measure, I think it's fair to say that the old ones were by, for, and about Jews. And very often they were consistent with this approach to basically show Jews in the best possible light in support of emancipation or full citizenship or to fight anti-Semitism, discrimination, etc. So one of our first, we made a list of what we didn't want to be. We didn't want to be apologetic. We didn't want to be defensive. We didn't want to have a teleological narrative that started with hate and ended with genocide. There were a whole set of, what Moshe Rossman calls meta-historical principles, which are essentially a way to think historiographically about this history that guided the way in which we constructed this history. And that was very, very, very important to us. And I'm not so sure that many other Jewish museums go through that exercise. I think many of them have a story they want to tell. Largely in the United States, it's a triumphalist narrative. It's about the bad old world and the great new world. And it's a kind of a triumphalist story. And in Europe, we'd have to go one by one by one. Munich, Hohenems, London, Frankfurt, Berlin, Rome, Paris, we'd have to go one by one. Because each of them is really, really quite different. And many of them have really wonderful collections that were formed well before the war. But if we go to Berlin, Berlin is a fascinating story, absolutely fascinating story, because what begins as a couple of rooms and a small Judaica collection in a city museum, and there were two of them. There was a Berlin City Museum in West Berlin, a Berlin City Museum in East Berlin, and the evolution of these two rooms into an extension that would be created by the Liebeskind, where Jews would be present by virtue of their absence, to where the entire Berlin story disappears and the entire old building and new building become a Jewish museum. But the biggest difference is that the Liebeskind building says one thing and one thing only: Holocaust. Outside, inside, architecture, garden, memorial, axis, everywhere you turn, it is an overwhelming message. And that's one of the reasons, and I visited it when it was empty, it was one of the reasons that Tom Freudenheim and others said, best leave it empty and just have performances in it, have temporary exhibitions, leave it empty. You have the voids, you have, it's so programmatic. It's such architecture parlant. In that way, I would say start with the architecture. That is Holocaust, sharp, angular, metal. It's like I don't know, a tank, only beautiful. I mean, I think it's stunning from an architectural point of view. It's stunning. What's our building? Glass, reflection, light, transparency, open. And so ours is an architecture of hope on a site of genocide, and theirs is an architecture of trauma. It's trauma architecture on a site in Berlin, but it's not site specific in the way that ours is site specific, because it's an extension of the old Berlin City Museum. And so in that, I would say that if you were just to take the architecture, you would have the contrast between the two. But as for the approach, what I would say is both of them are long histories. In Berlin, they claim that there's evidence of Jewish presence from Roman times, and then there's a big gap in the history, and then they pick it up again in the Middle Ages. And of course, they've created a brand new permanent exhibition, which I think is going to be amazing, or is amazing. I haven't had a chance to see it. I can hardly wait to see it. But I think it's going to set a whole new benchmark in terms of how you present a long Jewish history in a museum, with a very contemporary approach to design, a contemporary approach to curation, a contemporary approach to narration, and with a very kind of contemporary art sensibility. So I think that that's going to be one to really, really watch.
Barbara, when you think ahead, next 10 years, with all that you've been saying about the difficulties with Polish interpretation, Polish pressure in terms of politics and so on and so forth, how do you feel Poland, the Museum Poland, will be able to sustain itself in a changing political situation?
Well, the challenges are huge, but I would say actually that the pandemic is transforming our world, not just while it's happening, but I don't know what the world's going to look like when the worst of it is over. I really don't, and how much damage will have been done in the interim. So POLIN Museum is managing under these pandemic conditions, but I do think that represents an existential threat to museums generally, to POLIN Museum in particular, and I think, of course, to universities and obviously to the economy. So let's put that aside and think politically. Needless to say, I and my colleagues and many of us are working very, very hard for the next election in Poland to bring back a more centrist party as the ruling party. And the likelihood of one party being in power for more than one term was already unlikely, and this one is in power for 2, and the chances of it being in power for 3 terms, we just have to hope that the closeness of the election this time is a kind of a prelude to a more centered party coming up. So the question is, what would it be like if this party continued? What would it be like if there was a new political situation? So in this case, in either case, but especially under the current ruling party, I would say that what saves us is the private-public partnership. It's the Jewish NGO and our network of benefactors, mainly Jewish benefactors, mainly American Jewish benefactors, but not only. The single largest gift from a private individual came from the richest man in Poland, from Jan Kulczyk, who unfortunately passed away. So it's not only Jewish and not only American, but that is very, very important. And those benefactors are really, really stakeholders. They're not just benefactors. They care deeply about the museum, and they care deeply about its future. And they have been with us for like really from the beginning. I mean, some of them have been with us since the late 90s, some of them from the early 2000s. And it doesn't look to us like they're going anywhere, but staying absolutely with us. So I would say that those two, those are two factors. One, the Jewish NGO, because they have a certain amount of power in who becomes the director. That's another conversation. They have moral authority. Our benefactors are donor-based because the Jewish Association does the fundraising. And then I would say also our success. We have been enormously successful. We have had over 4 million visitors since we opened. We are getting between 500,000 and 700,000 visitors a year. There is no Jewish museum, and I'm not talking about Holocaust museums. They're something else. There is no Jewish museum in North America that gets anywhere near that kind of visitation. I would say the only competitor is the Jewish Museum Berlin. They also get very, very high visitor numbers, but that's Berlin, not Warsaw. I mean, Berlin is a real hub and a tourist city. So our success in visitor numbers and our success in terms of the respect. I mean, we got the 2016 European Museum of the Year Award, the 2016 European Academy Prize, the Europa Nostra Best in Heritage for Education Programs. I mean, every prize in the book, international, national, for our temporary exhibitions, our publications, our public programs, you name it. So, I mean, we are, it exceeds my wildest expectations. We have a fantastic team. So with all of those awards, with that kind of visitation, with the positive media coverage, we get great media coverage, lots of it, and very, very strong and very international. So I think those are our bulwarks in, going forward. They are our bulwarks. And we're just doing everything we can, not just to survive, but to thrive, no matter what the conditions, no matter what the political party, and no matter what the existential threat of the current horrible virus and economic situation.
You should see how many people in the chats have mentioned when you spoke about a need for a more centrist party that would rule Poland, who are probably thinking of a few other countries that we are all related to.
Welcome to New York.
So in that way, Jerusalem, New York, and a few other countries in Europe are in the same situation. But coming back to the internal scene, we want to develop Poland further and criticize certain things that you did in the past. If you had a carte blanche, what would I do now that I should have done then? And what is important that I should attend to in the future there?
Okay, so, as the person, I'm currently the chief curator of the core exhibition. So I keep on thinking in terms of the core exhibition, but in fact, our educational programs are among the finest in any museum in the world, truly. We have a huge education department. Our public programs are outstanding. We have become the address for music in Warsaw, for interesting, new, and diverse music. So we are many, many, many things. So, but I can only speak with some authority about the core exhibition, which is the heart and soul and the foundation for everything else that we do. So the first thing I should say is that I am very, very proud that we formed a committee. I would say, not really a committee, a team would be more appropriate. A team of academics, of scholars from Israel, United States, and Poland that were with us in developing the content and the narrative of the exhibition from the beginning, and who continue to be on our historical collegium to oversee any changes to the core exhibition. And the idea that we continue to have that kind of a relationship with our academic team, for me, is a mark of a huge success. It really means that that we respected them, they respected us, and we worked effectively together, and that we are all equally invested in the life of this exhibition going forward, which is not simply to preserve it as we made it, but also to continue to correct it, improve it, and change it. So we are engaged in that process. So it's not just what would we do if we were to start all over again, it's what are we doing now to learn from our visitors, learn from what we've done to make this exhibition even better, and also to update it. So let me start there and then go to what we would do if we were to start all over again. So for example, one of the most difficult areas to present is the period after 1989. And one of the things that we were cautioned against doing is ending on a triumphalist note. 1989, the fall of communism, the renewal of Jewish life, you know, the end of a great story. Because it's after 1989, the Jewish community in Poland is very small, absolute numbers, relative numbers, any way you want to count. The renewal of Jewish life is on a very small scale, which doesn't make it any less important. And the Polish-Jewish relations are, if you will, better, but not perfect. And certainly anti-Semitism continues to be a factor in I would say, Polish and Jewish life. And so our concept for the period after 1989 was small numbers, big presence, by which we meant in absolute and relative numbers, the number of Jews is very small, but Jewish presence in Polish consciousness is enormous. And that's what we wanted to communicate. So we did that by conducting a bunch of interviews in 2014 with about 20 individuals, and we asked them a series of questions. What does Israel mean to you? Is Judaism important? Who can make Jewish culture? Is there anti-Semitism in Poland? Is there a future for Jews in Poland? And there was one question that came to me as a total surprise, because it's a question I never would ever have thought to ask. I don't think you would ever have thought to ask it. And the question was, did you always know you were Jewish? I would never have thought to ask it. So when people ask, how many Jews are there in Poland? The chief rabbi's answer is usually, I don't know how many Jews there are in Poland. All I know is that the number keeps going up, but the birth rate doesn't. So clearly, you know, we know that's the answer. That's one of the answers to that question. Now, it's now 5 years. It's now 5 years since we did those interviews. And we have a great big video where we were trying to present, if you will, Jewish presence in Polish consciousness. But it's a very difficult space. It's an architectural space. We can't control light. We can't control sound. It wasn't very good. And then we had a brilliant idea. This is from Joanna Fikus, our head of exhibitions. Why don't we do another set of interviews 5 years later? 5 years later, and have 2 points in time, 2014, or more or less, 2020, more or less, and from a different generation, a different set of people, a different set of questions, and let's have 2 points in time. So that would be an example of a way in which we are updating, changing the exhibition. That would be one example. A second would be that we want to incorporate more original objects. We want to replace loans with original objects in our collection, which means we have to acquire them. We want to replace replicas with original objects, preferably from our collection. And so we've been doing that, and only in support of the story, not just simply to put, quote, more original objects in the exhibition. So we've been doing that, and in doing that, it has meant also reorganizing, restructuring, and improving some of the exhibition areas. So those would be just two very specific examples. But to go to the first question, which was, if we were to start all over again, what would we do? Well, first of all, I think I would organize the space differently, and I would allocate it differently. Because I think that what happened was that the designers wanted to start at the beginning and go period by period, gallery by gallery. And as a result, the allocation of space was not actually made all at one time, but it was to some degree adjusted to the development of that gallery. And as a result, I think that there is probably a disproportion in the space allocated to the earlier periods, and also not an adequate, from my point of view, the space for Holocaust is okay. I would say the two spaces that suffered as a result are 19th century and post-war. If I had to select two spaces where I feel that we could have done a better job if we had somehow rather dealt with the process of space allocation differently, that would be one. And that's actually major, and we can do nothing about it now. The second, which I don't think people would think about, would be sound. We were not thinking about, I mean, I have never worked on an exhibition that had a soundscape. And I don't think I fully reckoned with the importance of a soundscape for this exhibition. And it didn't come into focus as something we had to address until very late in the process. And as a result, I don't think that it was adequately planned for. And just technically in terms of where the speakers are, because it has to do with the direction of sound, with sound showers, with sound cones, all kinds of technical things, but also the nature of it. I think we could have done a better job. And the third thing would be that there are some topics that I now really regret didn't get fuller attention. And if I had to single out one, it would be music. It's there, music is there, but I do think that we could have done more with it than we do. But and I think there are some ways that we can actually do something about that. That would be something we could do something about. But one would be like a kind of a macro issue, and the other would be a more technical issue, and the third would be a more thematic issue.
In a sense, even in this very short conversation, I think one can see that to create such a museum in Warsaw in the 1990s, eventually in 2015, we have issues of designers, we have issues of politics, we have issues of understanding history, we have curators who want to bring on their understanding, historians who think that they have the right understanding. And all this comes together, and somebody comes into the museum and has no sense of how complicated this process actually was and is, and continues to be. And in a sense, Barbara, what I think that you've given us here in a very, very small but insightful way is how problematic it is to build something like this and to stay with it until it's actually standing. And your vision of the future then would be what?
Well, I would say not only till it's still standing, but for years afterwards. Actually, not only till it's still standing, but for as long as I'm still standing. God willing, But so what I would say is that we were also faulted for not making it more meta-museological. In other words, for not incorporating ourselves as curators and museum makers. So I would make just a couple of comments on this. The first thing is that we had an academic team that was intellectually diverse, very, very important, that they were not all from the Warsaw University Department of History. So what does that mean? They were Jewish and there were non-Jews. There were at least two who were Orthodox observant Jews, others that were absolutely secular. There were born and bred in Israel, there were children of Holocaust survivors, and it was multidisciplinary. It was literally social psychology, literature, religious studies, performance studies, anthropology, sociology, history, art history. So it was multidisciplinary, international, Jewish, not Jewish. And as a result, and people trained in different intellectual environments, different intellectual formations. I think that was the making of it. It wasn't one mindset. So the debates that we had and I would say, coming coming to awareness of sensitivities from, from this diverse group was a really very important factor in the shaping of this exhibition. Now, there is one place where we do our metamuseological thing, and that is we keep it out of the exhibition because in the exhibition, we want to keep our visitors in the story, inside the period and inside the story. But when they come up to the main floor, the beautiful wooden synagogue roof comes up from the exhibition level onto the main floor level, and we have created a glass ledge around it where we present how we made it and the archival material that we used to make it, and this wooden synagogue in relation to other wooden synagogues. That's our metamuseological moment. And then, of course, it's there obviously in publications and articles and whatnot. And also it was there in the temporary exhibition that we had up when we opened. We had our grand opening. We had a whole temporary exhibition just about the making of the permanent exhibition. So it was there, but not as a permanent feature and not inside the exhibition itself. Oh, one last thing. In terms of visitor responses, there was one response that I wanted to include when we were talking about how do Jews respond, how do Poles respond. An older gentleman left the exhibition some years ago, and he said, he said, this is a museum of Polish history. Mm-hmm. And I thought, brilliant. Here, it's a tribute to him that he could see a history of Polish Jews, of one of the minorities, incredible. A museum of Polish history that's not a museum of the Polish state, of the Polish nation, that there's more than one way of being Polish. And it was a tribute to us that we could create an exhibition that he could recognize as his history. So that was for me one of the greatest moments in terms of visitor response.
Barbara, we don't have much more time, but there have been more than 100 chats. And I've asked Doron to choose 3 questions which somebody has asked, and he will present them to you, and you'll do with them whatever you see is appropriate. Go ahead, Doron.
Thank you very much. First of all, there were a lot of requests in the chat for images, so I took the liberty of posting the website of the POLIN Museum. I understand there's a virtual tour, and there's many images of the exhibits on the website, so you're all very welcome to cruise around that site. Aside from that, I'd also like to read 2 compliments that are in the chat. One from Marilyn, who says, fascinating information and approach to creating a museum on a site of extreme trauma and offering a perspective of light and hope. Bravo, Barbara. You are a stellar presence in our Jewish historical narrative. Thank you. And also Janine said, this is fascinating and inspiring. Joy asked a question, do you know the percentage of Jews versus non-Jews visiting the museum? Is that a question you asked upon entrance?
Okay, I can respond to that. We know that when we first opened, we were getting about 70% visitors from Poland and about 30% international, and usually half the international are Jewish, from Israel and from the diaspora. Now, at this stage, 5-6 years later, with visitors having increased to about 700,000 at its peak, in the high season, which would be like March through October, we can easily get 50-50 from Poland, 50% international. And again, it's more or less half and half Jewish and from the international. More or less half Jewish from Israel and the diaspora, and approximately would be half international from Europe and other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. There are 2 questions that are very closely related, so I'll ask them together. Charles asked, does Poland have a museum cooperative agreement with other museums and cultural institutions around the world, and specifically in the US? And Vlad asked, how are the cooperations with other museums from Europe?
Yes. So yes, the answer is yes. We have, in some cases, what I would call a kind of a signed or official partnership, for example, with the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. but more often it's, I would call it cooperation. So for example, we are organizing an international conference. We have a research division, what we call our scientific division, and we're organizing an international conference on the future of Jewish studies with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And we're partnering with the museum, the Memorial de la Shoah Museum in Paris, with the Holocaust Museum, with Yad Vashem, and also with universities. So we partner with other organizations on projects. We also, for example, we've taken several temporary exhibitions from the Jewish Museum in London. And so basically I would say not so much formal partnerships as cooperation.
Thank you very much. Charles asked, how does the POLIN Museum incorporate contemporary issues, controversies, art into the dialogue with 1,000 years of history?
Well, we do, and the Minister of Culture is not happy. So one of the most one of the most scandalous, I would say, all right, so let me be specific. March 1968, 50 years ago, we tell the story. The very end of the exhibition, we do what we often do, which is to explore the contemporary resonances of these historical events. So what did we do? A small section at the very, very end, we identified statements made today by politicians, by TV presenters, by other public figures that are virtually identical to the anti-Semitic statements that were made 50 years ago in the context of the March 1968 anti-Semitic campaign. Well, and we crossed out their names. They were tweets, they were from television, they were in the media, in the press. Somebody comes to the museum, sees one of these tweets, unidentified, but recognizes it, recognizes who said it, goes to the woman who's a TV presenter and says to her, did you know that your tweet is on the wall of that exhibition and they say that it's anti-Semitic? She's furious. She sends a letter to the director and she says to the director, you have to remove that tweet and you have to issue a public apology. He says, no. He says, but I want to invite you to the, and she says, and I love your museum and I bring my 12-year-old daughter to your museum. He says, come to the museum, I'll show you the exhibition, we'll have a conversation. She said, no, if you don't do it, I'm taking you to court. So she took him to court and immediately 3 of the top lawyers in Poland offered to represent him pro bono. And eventually, to make a long story short, the case was thrown out of court. I mean, the lawyers could hardly wait for this, and the director also, because it would be a great referendum on what constitutes an anti-Semitic statement and how dangerous it is not to be aware. In other words, nobody was saying that she's anti-Semitic, not at all. The statement, because she actually is very positive about the museum. Well, this became a cause célèbre, and you may wonder, what was the statement? So, the leader of Confederacja, which is the far right, super far right, very anti-Semitic party, he was, I think he was criticizing a more liberal guy. And this TV presenter said to the more liberal guy, Mr. Borowski, why did you change your name from Berman? Well, first of all, this was a standard ploy in March 68 to reveal or to out people whose names had changed to Polish sounding names to their Jewish name, which is a way of saying you're Jewish. But what was the point of that statement? Why was it relevant? What was she trying to say? She's trying to say somehow or other you're Jewish, you're not really who you are. As it turns out, his father changed the name, which is irrelevant, and his father was the editor of a communist newspaper, which is also irrelevant. But this was her statement, and she did not understand why there was any problem with it. She didn't see why that could be construed as anti-Semitic. However, the beauty of the controversy that ensued, because the Minister of Culture was outraged and the far right was outraged and there was a whole brouhaha, is that, as one media person said, POLIN Museum did not have to do any PR for this exhibition. The government did it for them. And we got 117,000 visitors to this exhibition, which broke all records of attendance for a temporary exhibition on an historical topic.
Barbara, I must say, in the name of all the people who have listened carefully to this conversation, that it's been wonderful seeing you, wonderful hearing you, and many people would want further conversations with you and further contact. I'm sure that they will have opportunities to hear you in different places. I want to wish you and everybody who's been listening a Shana Tova, and thank you in the name of the National Library for agreeing to be part of this series on various Jewish museums. And look forward to seeing you soon.
Well, I want to thank you because I have such deep affection and regard for you. We have known each other for a very long time. We are fellow Canadians, among other things that we share. And I was thrilled when I was told that you would be my interlocutor. Absolutely thrilled. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank the National Library, and I want to thank Duran for this opportunity, and I want to thank everybody who took the time to come and be part of the conversation.
Have a good evening. Toda
Thank you.
rabba.
Thank you so much. I will open all the microphones now so that people can say thank you personally. Thank you, everybody. Shana Tova. Have a healthy, happy, sweet New Year.
Toda, 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 Barbara.
Barbara, thank you from a Klutz camper.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, from Edith from Montreal.
Well, a good Montrealer saying something to a Torontonian, that's fine. That's fine.
Thanks.
Thank you from Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Ah,
Thank you from Cape Town, South Africa.
Wow.
Thank you from Richmond.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you
Thank
from
you.
San Diego, California.
Thank you from Richmond, Virginia.
Thank you from Ottawa, Canada.
Thank you from Chelsea, Quebec.
Thank you from Reading, Pennsylvania.
London, England.
Thank you.
Israel.
Oh.
Jacksonville, Florida.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Jerusalem, Israel. Thank you.
San
From
Diego,
Boston area.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you from Lafayette, California, and the Jewish Heritage Museum in the Rutlinger Senior Housing.
Thank you from Cape Town, South Africa.
And from Los Angeles, California, thank you very much.
And from Ireland, Pennsylvania.
You said something about a link to a question.
Oh, dear. Key.
If I may, thank you so much, Barbara. You don't see a picture of me because I'm having a bad hair day. I'm in Maryland, and I must, if I can, plug that we will be honored to have you speak for us on October 8th at the Bender JCC. Thank you.